Hello, and welcome to this video workshop run by the Yale Graduate Writing Lab on writing an effective reference letter. My name is Yamur, and I will be running this workshop. We will be discussing today the art of writing a reference letter. So let's start off with a little bit of brainstorming about why we write reference letters, when, and for whom. Feel free to take out a piece of paper and jot some of these ideas down. You're welcome to pause the video during various moments, but I'll summarize some of the responses from attendees of this workshop in the past. Of course, we write reference letters for people with whom we've worked, students, sometimes even our superiors. At times, we often write reference letters for ourselves, right? Especially when a professor or perhaps a boss needs a little bit of help, or you'd like to really portray some of the wonderful things that you've done in your current work environment. In this way, we are able to support the next generation of students, to support people who are promising, to support our colleagues when they deserve, of course, to be supported. We can also recognize and support some of our mentors, especially if you are writing a reference letter in nomination for an award, for example. And then often we are in a position to verbalize our own contributions as well, putting them down on paper and really substantiating them through our words. Thus, we should care about writing reference letters because, in a sense, we are able to determine who in our field goes forward and sometimes even how far. We're able to help these excellent individuals succeed, help people who really deserve it, who are team players, who help others in return. We can also support other people in our professional circles. And in addition to that, we can support ourselves in reaching our full career potential and becoming leaders in our own fields. So when beginning to write a reference letter, the most important piece is to seek out multiple resources. And I'll explain what that means in essence. Let's say you're writing a reference letter for a student or for a colleague. You would like to have the resume or CV of that individual, and it is certainly expected and normal to ask for these items. You can and should ask for the description of the position or the opportunity, whether that's a scholarship or a fellowship. You can also ask the individual, who else is writing for you? How can I show another side of you that the people on the other end would be appreciative of and would be interested in reading about? And of course, after all this information, you should think critically about what the position is specifically looking for. For example, if you are writing a reference letter for someone in academia, you can look at some of the HHMI resources, especially in the sciences. That is one resource that is very helpful in crafting reference letters and being sure to hit the right tone. Let's say you're writing a reference letter for a student, perhaps applying to medical school. You can, in that case, refer to the AAMC. And here I've linked a couple of resources, which we will also include as links in the description part of this video. And you're welcome to reference some of these resources as well. For smaller scholarships or smaller, less common opportunities, you should ask the individual for whom you are writing directly. And do not be shy about sitting down, maybe grabbing a coffee or lunch and brainstorming together. This will save you a ton of time in writing the reference letter, and it will really help clarify some of the things that you should be writing about, and will likely turn out to be a more effective reference letter on the end of the student, right? Or student or individual colleague, whoever you are writing for. When seeking out these resources, be sure that they are credible. Of course, HHMI and AAMC are credible. You can talk with other successful applicants, or perhaps if you know individuals at your university who read and critique these applications, you can talk with them as well. Other individuals with whom to speak would be lab mates or people in your research group, or your professor if you're more on the humanities end. Certainly your thesis committee, other professors inside or outside the department, and as we mentioned, knowledgeable sites that have the credentials to back up the information they are featuring. Before you even begin writing the reference letter, take some time and think about the tone that you should adopt for the reference letter. I've given some examples here, and I'm beginning to craft a bit of a theme in that writing a reference letter is like crafting a nice meal. I'm not personally very good at cooking, but I'm sure many of you are who are viewing this video. So let's think about this theme and think about some of the ways that we can relate tone to the theme of writing a wonderful reference letter. Let's say you're writing for a medical school applicant. Medical schools look for personal attributes, what they bring to the table, what they bring to the team, to the class, how diverse they are, examples of compassion and perseverance. So in that sense, these kinds of reference letters take a more personal tone, a bit of a sweeter tone, shall we say. On the flip side of things, if you're writing for postdocs or industry positions, here, again, we look for teamwork, but we also look for strong technical skills, leadership abilities. These are a little bit harder qualities than the softer, quote unquote, compassion and being there for others, etc. So this shows a bit of a spectrum that we have here. In the middle would be graduate school applicants, where we look for perseverance, research experience, passion in the classroom, interest in the subject area. So that would fall in the middle of the spectrum shown here. Feel free to discuss the tone ahead of time with the individual for whom you are writing, or with other individuals who may have written these kinds of reference letters before. Let's take a look at this example here. Please pause the video and read through the excerpt. And what you should be able to answer after doing that is, what kind of tone have we adopted? And then take a stab, pun intended, I suppose, take a stab at understanding what kind of reference letter this is. So for whom is this individual writing? After reading through this excerpt, and feel free to pause the video if you haven't had a chance to do that, you should be able to understand that this is a reference letter written for a colleague. It takes a maybe middle of the spectrum kind of tone. It's not entirely soft, talking about compassion and people skills, but it's not entirely data-driven or technical either. So it falls right around in the middle, and this is an example of how one could do that. In writing the reference letter that you have on your plate now, or perhaps multiple reference letters, what kind of tone will you take? Take a moment to jot that down on your sheet of paper and really think about why you think you should be taking this particular tone. Let's return back to the theme of this video workshop, in that writing a reference letter is like preparing a great meal. When preparing a meal, we start with some structure, right? We have the plates and cups and all the things that we need, the utensils and the cooking ingredients, whatever. And in essence, this is like the structure of your reference letter. So you'll want to begin with letterhead every single time, even if you make the letterhead yourself. And I'll give an example of a situation where that could be done. You want to have the date, address, yours and also the recipient's, in the heading. And in addition, you want to include your name, signature, and your own title at the very bottom. We'll talk a little bit more about the formatting of the body of the reference letter, but it will be similar to an academic essay. Some of the things that we've learned to write throughout grade school and through college and graduate education as well. So think of it with this kind of solid type of structure. However, if you are writing a reference letter and you happen to be a student, you can avoid titles like student. You can write the name of your university, for example, and this will be a gentle way of avoiding losing power in the reference letter that you're writing. Here are a couple examples of proper letterhead. This one in particular is from the pharmacology department at Yale, and you can see we have the university logo, very nicely written, everything is nicely organized, date, the recipient address, and then, of course, the recipient's name with the proper salutation, so doctor in this case, and be sure to look up that information. On the bottom here, we have an example of letterhead for someone who is not at this moment affiliated with a university, but she, in this case, has her own letterhead and has chosen to create it in this way. Date, and then a simpler address, Dear Admissions Committee, because this letter is going to go to multiple admissions committees. So you can keep it simple in that case. This is what I was talking about earlier when we say that we want to structure the reference letter like an essay. In essence, you have your topic paragraph, which at the very beginning should show how you met the applicant, how you got to know the applicant, and at the very end of this first paragraph, you should have a strong topic sentence. This topic sentence sets you up for supporting detail 1, 2, and 3, perhaps even more. And then at the very end, you have your concluding paragraph where you offer conclusions, summarizing, and a desire to offer more information. As I just mentioned, you can have additional paragraphs, additional supporting detail paragraphs, 4 and 5, let's say in this case. But the structure of your reference letter should be very clear, not necessarily with indentation. This is more just to explain the schematic, but with these very clear paragraph cutoffs and paragraphs that are digestible, not intimidating when you first look at the paragraph, because you want to give your readers enough white space so that they can breathe and digest the information as you are offering it. At the very beginning, we begin with the foundation of our meal, let's say in this case rice, and you'll want to begin with a solid foundation. In the first paragraph, this means describing how you met this individual, how you got to know them. You can choose to describe your qualifications, thus giving some context, and the relationship that ensued, working relationship that ensued. You can also state any initial positive impressions, and this will be something that cues the readers into how they should expect this individual to behave and work on a team at the immediate onset. As I mentioned, at the very end of this introductory paragraph, you should have a strong topic sentence. This, in essence, is the take-home message. Be sure to start with a positive tone right away. Don't have anything that may read a little funny, and we'll see an example of that. So be sure that the tone of your reference letter is positive straight out of the gate. Let's take a look at this example. Have a moment and pause the video so that you're able to read through this excerpt that we've shown here. What do you think about improving this opening paragraph? We see that the writer has started a wonderful opening paragraph. It is my great pleasure. I'm offering this reference letter. Here is the context in which I'm offering this reference letter. But what can we improve about the tone straight out of the gate here? Hopefully, many of you have picked up on the fact that an unpaid internship is not necessarily the most positive way to spin this. So we can take out the words unpaid and just say, closely with me, works closely with me as an intern at this incredible facility, etc., etc. You can see that the writer has chosen to bold part of the topic sentence here, the topic sentence that sets up the rest of the reference letter. She was driven, proved to be extremely efficient and capable. We were truly lucky to have her working with us this past semester. And in this way, this topic sentence sets up the rest of the letter. It's the opening statement that makes us understand, here's what we're getting ourselves into in reading this reference letter. After your first paragraph, you should then begin to add substance. So this will be like the meat and potatoes, the beans, let's say, of your meal, the major carbohydrate or protein element. And how you accomplish this is by making note of major accomplishments. You can choose to talk about the status of current projects and perhaps reference, papers this individual is writing, research projects and how they're going, for example. You can talk about special contributions to that lab environment, that class, the field, or the working environment through which you became closer to this person. You can also choose to describe this individual in 2 or 3 words in a professional sense and positively relaying some of the contributions that he or she has made. Again, you can brainstorm together. Ask the individual for which you are writing, what do you think are some of the major contributions that you've made? What are you especially proud of? Chances are you'll get to know this person deeper. It'll be easier and take less time to write the reference letter, and you'll also write a better reference letter as a result. Let's take a look at the worksheet that we've also linked in the description of this video. You can use this as a brainstorming tool, and at the very top, you should fill out who you're writing a reference letter for, what this person is to you, a colleague, a student, etc., and what the individual is applying for, and then a small description to help you keep track of the tone that you would like to take. Decide on the onset what the tone of this letter should be. Describe that tone in a couple words, and then describe how personal or how technical the content of your letter should be. In the larger gray boxes, you can here make a couple bullet points about the accomplishments you'd like to discuss, and then some specific comments that you'd like to include in this reference letter. This kind of worksheet is a lot less intimidating than a blank sheet of paper, so feel free to take this worksheet, print it out, use it for yourself, and it'll help you get on your way to writing the reference letter that you're working on. So what are some of the accomplishments that you will discuss? Take a moment to write this on your worksheet and take a moment to pause the video, fill the rest of the worksheet out as we go. Here are some ideas that you can use to talk about positive attributes. I wanted to feature this source here, which is a list of attributes that employees seek on a candidate's resume or in the reference letters that he or she is putting forward with the rest of his or her application. This comes from the National Association of Colleges and Employers, and what they've essentially done is done a survey of many different employers and asked, what do you look for? And then you'll see the percentage of respondents on the right and the attributes shown here in a list on the left. Very interestingly, the top, let's say, 10 skills are not necessarily technical skills. They are leadership, ability to work on a team, written communication skills, problem solving, verbal communication skills. I can continue reading this, but take a moment for yourself and think about what is most important to you, or better yet, what do you bring to the table? You'll see that technical skills falls almost in the middle of this spectrum here. And interestingly, some of the things like strategy or entrepreneurial skills, risk taking, fall much lower on the spectrum here, as does this friendly, outgoing personality. So be careful, especially when you are writing for women, about talking about how kind this individual is, because this plays into some gender bias that we'll talk about a little bit later briefly as well. But be careful when you're writing these kinds of reference letters and keep this list of valued attributes in mind. Take a moment and describe this individual for whom you are writing in a few words. Again, be sure that these are gender neutral and professional, work-oriented qualities that you're describing. And then be ready to support these statements with supporting examples. So I describe this person as a team player, a leader, and I'm making this up, but innovative or brings fresh ideas to the table, etc. And be ready to show how this person is a team player in an example, is a leader in an example, and then also is interested in pushing for innovative ideas in another example. Also take a moment and identify for yourself what your biggest concern is about when writing this reference letter. Usually for most of us, it is whether we have struck the appropriate tone, whether we are writing things that are going to be received well on the other side. We don't really know, right? I mean, we don't know what runs in the minds of our readers, but we can begin to understand that by, as we mentioned, way in the beginning, being sure to collect the important resources and understanding the recipient, what they're looking for, what the opportunity seeks, etc. And then take a moment, write down how you will proactively address this. Studies show that when we write things down and we say to ourselves, hey, I'm going to do this, we're more likely to make use of that opportunity. So be sure to go ahead and do that. You can address your concern by asking for feedback, showing it to a colleague, etc. I can assure you, and many people, 99.9% of people will tell you that getting feedback is perhaps the best thing you can do for anything that you've written. Even if you think you're an excellent writer, which certainly you are, certainly by attending this workshop, you have shown that you are interested in writing well. But even so, getting feedback is very important and very helpful. So what are some of the skills that you are planning on featuring? You can write that down on your worksheet. After you have filled in some of the body paragraphs, invite other people in. So you've made this incredible meal and invite others in by describing how this applicant would perform in their environment. Describe what the applicant brings to the fellowship opportunity as part of this fellowship community, or what this applicant brings to that work environment. Provide some supported predictions of success. Indicate how you think this individual would bring wonderful attributes and a team player spirit, what have you, to the table. Be sure to think big picture here and let the imagination, let's say, of the recipient fill in some of the blanks. Let's take a look at this example here. Feel free to pause the video and read through this. And by the end of reading through it, you should be able to understand and isolate perhaps the single mistake made in this final paragraph. We can see here that although we talk about how wonderful this individual is going to perform in the medical community as part of the medical school class, we can see here that we have gone a little bit overboard with this reference letter, so be careful of that. Especially, again, touching on this gender bias issue, don't go overboard with how friendly or how kind an individual is, and certainly in this case, other attributes that don't belong in this professional reference letter. And then at the tail end of your reference letter, add in the final touches. So maybe some spice, a little bit of salt and pepper, etc. Proofread the reference letter by printing it out. This is super important, and printing it out catches many-fold more errors that you would not have found by just looking at it on a computer screen. You can then consider bolding some key messages, but do this with caution. Do not overdo with the bolding, and certainly be careful. That can come across as either efficient or sometimes aggressive. So do this with a bit of, use your better judgment when doing that. Consider sharing the reference letter with your subject or getting feedback from multiple sets of eyes. Reread this reference letter to eliminate any common mistakes. So in that sense, spice it up, but not too much, and be careful in that respect. Here's an example of how we can finish off this reference letter. This has been written by Dr. I'm a Prof. I hope all of you appreciate the pun there. And take a moment to read through this, show how they can very warmly and efficiently close the reference letter, thus opening the stream of communication by showing that the writer is happy to be in touch by email or by phone if any additional information is required. You can also take a moment and reiterate some of the main points here. If you would like to summarize, that is also certainly fine. But if you think you've done enough of that in the reference letter, you can finish off very clean and efficiently like this. Here's one way that you can summarize some of the bulk of the letter at the very end, and you can see in this case we have bolded some of the key phrases. This is a very light touch and a way that you can accomplish that. As we were talking about summarizing some of the points of the reference letter, one way that you can do that is by making a comparison. You can see here the comparison that is made is that I can count on one hand the individuals I remember as excellent mentors, and this person ranks at the very top of this list. In this way, you are quantifying the value of this individual. You're offering a comparison that makes a very strong statement. That's one way that you can summarize all the wonderful things that you've written in the rest of the reference letter. And feel free to look through some of these examples and use some of these skeletal phrases, of course being true to yourself and to the person you're writing about, but feel free to take some of the examples of the tone and writing shown here. Let's now transition to talking about some common pitfalls, ways that you can avoid common mistakes that are made. Be sure to remember that whatever you have written reflects not only the subject, but also the writer, so it is also in your best interest to avoid some of these common issues. First and foremost, typos, grammar errors, and then if you're in a technical field or let's say very deep in a certain humanities academic subject, jargon. One of the typos most common would be he-she mismatch, especially toward the beginning or very, very end of the letter, where sometimes we forget to, we've copied a certain piece, we forget to correct the he or she, his or her in the letter and make it match with the individual for which you're writing, and then the rest of the letter, of course, as well. Confusing scientific terminology or other types of academic humanities, even types of jargon, and then either the incorrect address, date especially, or program name. Sometimes certain institutions will not accept a reference letter if some of these header type pieces are incorrect. Let's say the date is 2 years back or a year back, they will not accept it. So be very, very careful in making sure all of these things fly. And then a little bit more subtle perhaps, but even more important arguably, would be having an inappropriate focus or tone especially. Have you focused too much on personal attributes? Be careful about that. Or have you leaned too technical in some of the information that you're offering? Be careful, especially when you're writing about someone who is so important to you and is so promising. Be careful about using polarizing words. With an extremely driven personality or endured an exceptionally difficult transition. Some of these things raise red flags in the minds of your readers, and only use these polarizing words with sincerity and perhaps only once in a way that is genuine and that portrays maybe the one single wonderful thing about this individual. Again, these kinds of negative connotations should also be avoided. Gave an acceptable presentation. Sometimes the word acceptable is neutral and it's fine, but in a reference letter, it reads as actually not so great. Progress has been reasonable. Again, this is a very neutral word that can be read negatively in the context of a reference letter. In that same vein, avoiding polarizing words and then words that might have a slight negative connotation are generic statements. I've heard nothing but good things about this person, or I can say nothing but wonderful examples about this individual without showing the meat of the reference letter or supporting details. These kinds of statements are bland, and actually they make it look like you don't know the individual or you don't have anything substantial to say. Avoid repetition from the resume, so blah blah GPA, participated in clubs, etc., etc. That individual will have what he or she wants in the form of the resume, and what you really want to show is how you know this individual to function in the work environment or classroom environment, etc. Hinted before, avoiding grandiose statements is also very important. This person is the very best student in this department. Well, I mean, what is this individual doing with his or her time to be the very best student? For example, achieving the highest scores on every exam. Are they using their time effectively? Do you not have better things to say or more substantial things to say about this individual? And the analogy here would be like a salad that has perhaps too much dressing when using these kinds of grandiose statements. Again, less can be more, subtle can be better, so be careful in that respect. Let's take a moment to briefly touch on how to ask for a reference letter before, during, and after the process. Before asking for a reference letter, make it easy on yourself, earn the letter ahead of time, do the work and then some, offer your own special contributions to that work environment by using your unique background. Make sure to stay in touch with your mentors, update them on accomplishments, shoot them an email, wish them, happy holidays or whatever it is, and give them a little bit of highlights on how things are going for you on the path, your career path, or some of the major accomplishments that you've put forward recently. When asking for the reference letter, be sure to do so with professionalism. State why you're applying, what it is you're applying for. Maybe mention how they've impacted you and why you're asking them to write the reference letter. State what you'd like to do in the future, career-wise, and then show how this opportunity will help you get there. You can then choose to offer some assistance or some perspective. You can, in your email, list specifics to focus on. Offer a list of major accomplishments that explain some of the things that you've been up to. You could even offer to draft an outline, or you could offer to create a first draft. It will depend on the writer from whom you are asking a reference, what he or she takes you up on. So offer gently, but be prepared. I mean, they might ask you to write a first draft, especially if they're super, super busy, or they might say, no, I'll write it on my own, but be sure that they know what they're doing or do you justice in writing the reference letter. Here's an example of Stella, student, writing to I'm a prof. You can reference this in your own time. Feel free to pause the video, but here's one way that you can craft the ask in this respect. Check in appropriately, especially after offering the due date. Take a hands-on approach, but not too much. Be, pretty chill about it. Make note of deadlines as they draw near, let's say a month in advance, 2 weeks, or 1 week, and then make sure they get it in the day of, gently and kindly. They'll appreciate you as long as you're not breathing down their neck. They'll appreciate you taking this straightforward, hands-on approach because that'll make their life easier as well. Reiterate your willingness to help if you think that's appropriate, and then absolutely all the time be on your best behavior with assistance. Usually these individuals are the ones who are going to go to bat for you when the deadline draws near, so be on your very best behavior. There are also times when someone has asked you for a reference letter when to say no, and this is normal, very common. It has actually happened to everyone, being told no for a reference letter. Some of the examples of why you can and should say no would be that you cannot be enthusiastic about a student or the person who's asking for the reference letter. Maybe you don't know them well, you cannot recall them much beyond the grade, or unfortunately, maybe you are approached unprofessionally about it. Sometimes you really truly do not have time or enough material, as we mentioned, to write a reference letter. Let's say you're on sabbatical or something. It is much, much better to say no ahead of time. This will help the individual, and it will help them understand what they're up against and seek a better, more appropriate source. Sometimes also you are not the best person to write this reference letter. This certainly happens. Let's say you know that this individual would really benefit from, let's say, the head of the department writing a reference letter, or let's say a clinical individual writing this reference. It's really important to identify that in advance and just be upfront, be kind about it, meet with them. This is totally fine. If and when you receive a phone call follow-up and you are asked about weaknesses, be honest. I should make a note here where sometimes in reference letters written in Europe, those writers are a little bit more honest about weaknesses. They put them up out front. This is not the case in America. Usually we write positive things or refuse to write the reference letter if there are too many weaknesses about which we are aware, or leave that area blank, let's say, leave that information out in a reference letter. But this is not the case when it comes to European reference letters, or perhaps reference letters from writers abroad. So let's say you're working in America and you receive a phone call, you're asked about weaknesses. Keep it positive, but be honest. Cite job-related weaknesses, not personal weaknesses. Maybe let's say you have someone who has no career-related weaknesses, but they, I don't know, they're overly friendly or something. Don't say that. Make sure that the weaknesses that you're talking about are work-related, because just because you could not find something work-related doesn't mean that you should talk about this individual on a personal basis regarding their weaknesses. Be honest about them, make it work-related, and follow up with a positive. So, for example, she or he does not have experience working with a bunch of different cell lines, but he or she picks up these new skills quickly. Omit discussion on topics that you cannot really evaluate. Just say, I don't know that person in that respect, or we haven't worked on those techniques. If you must write a reference letter and you don't have that much positive to say, you can keep the letter brief. Unfortunately, sometimes those of us who are having reference letters written by people who are very, very busy get reference letters who are brief anyway. So be aware of how that can read. If you write a very brief reference letter, it can almost read negatively. And in that respect, be prepared for a phone call about the applicant. This is pretty common, especially in today's age. After viewing this video workshop, what are some of your questions? Write down a few of your questions on your worksheet, on the back of your worksheet, or on a scrap piece of paper, and take a moment, reflect on these, look up some of this information, or talk with colleagues. Here are some questions from previous attendees. This one is particularly interesting. How do I recommend a student who had not so wonderful performance in my arena, but is going into a less ambitious field? Take a moment to think about this. Feel free to pause the video, maybe even jot down a couple ideas, especially if you've ever been in this situation. One thing you can do, as we mentioned throughout the rest of this talk, is project how you think that individual will perform in this other field. Avoid saying, oh, your field is easier, or anything along those lines, but project. Show how this individual has portrayed some skills that can be applied to their future goals, and in that respect, allow them to successfully enter that field, even though you may think it is less ambitious. Perhaps this person is going to go to the very, very top of their field, so really, how can we say? What do I do when I was asked to write my own reference letter? Help. This is another question posed by one of the attendees. The very best way to write your own reference letter is to follow the worksheet as shown that we've linked, follow the advice given on this presentation, but avoid being overly enthusiastic when writing about yourself. Sometimes when we have to write our own reference letter, we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, I can't believe this person threw this on me. Look at my situation. I can't even get someone to write a reference letter for me. And we overdo the reference letter by making it sometimes too awesome, right? This is mentioned in one of the resources that we've linked. The professor is in who talks about academic reference letters. They write about how they can tell when someone has written their own reference letter because it is too overly enthusiastic. In that respect, to avoid that, get your letter workshopped. Ask a good friend who can tone it down for you without hurting your feelings, or ask a colleague. Thank you for attending and viewing this video workshop on how to write a reference letter. Again, my name is Yalmor. It's been a pleasure giving this video workshop, and I hope that it has helped you in crafting a reference letter for your students, for a colleague, or a mentor of yours, or even for yourself. Thank you for attending.